proselytize,
or apostatize.
What's up, David?
What's up, bud?
Hey, I need a nickname for you on this show, man. David's a pretty generic name. I've been thinking about it, and I think I want to call you the Russell.
The Russell?
Can I call you?
Why is that?
Kind of like Brussels sprouts, kind of like Brussels, Switzerland. Isn't Brussels in Switzerland?
Somewhere.
It's somewhere in Europe. Russell's your last name, and that's a pretty dope name. So I think from here on out on the show, I'm going to call you the Russell.
Yeah, well, that's what Brandon calls me. Everybody
He calls you the Russell?
Last name here.
Dude, this is proof for the existence of God right here. That like I started calling you the Russell on the very episode that our guest calls you that. Man, that there's no way that's a coincidence. I'm gonna text Jordan, our atheist buddy, right after this, and I'm sure he'll convert immediately.
I'm sure he will.
Yeah, man. So how have you been?
I've been good, man. It's a little stressful today. My computer's not working. It took me a half an hour to get Audacity up almost. And yeah, my Skype isn't working on the computer, so we're doing everything by phone. So other than that, training is going great. I got a lot of my training done. I still got a few more classes left. Brandon knows what that's all about. So yeah, other than that, man, that's been it.
Yeah, I hear you, man. I've been, you know what? One of my pet peeves is when people are always like, "Ah, man, I'm just so busy." Because I mean, that's such an uncreative thing to say about your life. Like you're busy because you've chosen to be busy, and so but it's very true of my life right now. Like work has been just wild, and we're closing on our house on the 30th. So I want to get moved. Yeah, man, I'm stoked about that. I want to get moved out of this house so I'm not paying rent and mortgage. But I'm sure you'd be very willing to come over here and help me move when I do that. So I'm volunteering you to do that.
Sure, man. As long as you can come over and help me get the leaves out of my backyard.
Yeah, we can do a little labor swap. Sounds good. Well, hey, we have a guest on the show. I believe it's your coworker, David. The Russell. So Russell, can you introduce our guest?
Yeah, his name is Brandon Feldman, and we work together. And what's really interesting is he's a pagan, and so I thought, wow, what a good idea to have him come on the show because me and him have conversations left and right. So, welcome, Brandon.
How's it going, guys? Glad to be here.
Good.
Yeah, so I'm curious how you guys got to talking about religion. Like Brandon, did the Russell come up to you and say, "Do you have a personal relationship with my Lord and Savior?" Like, is that how that got started?
That sounds like something he'd say. Honestly, I don't recall. They always say don't talk religion at work, but inevitably it happens anyway.
Yeah, no kidding.
Right on.
So you guys are both, you're also a security guard, Brandon?
Yeah.
Cool.
I've been for some time now.
Cool. How long have you guys been working together?
Well, I started there, last August, so coming up on a year now.
Nice.
Time flies, man.
Doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, so why don't we let you start off here, Brandon, and just kind of share a little bit about your religious worldview. I don't know a lot about paganism. I was doing a little research today, but if you could share kind of how you were raised, like if you were raised in a specific religion, and then how you embraced paganism. I'm guessing you weren't raised as a pagan. You may have been, just not many people in our nation have been. So I kind of be interested in hearing that journey for you.
No, I most certainly was not raised pagan. It's a bit of a long story, but I'll try to keep to the major plot points. I was actually raised in a reasonably Jewish household. My grandparents were pretty religious. My parents, a little less so. And I stuck with that for the better part of my life until I was about 17 or 18. And as most things do in a man's life, my journey started because of a woman. And this girl that I had met when I was a senior in high school. And she was kind of into some of the spiritual stuff, you know, things like tarot card readings and crystals and all that kind of stuff, a little bit of Wicca. Kind of piqued my interest. I was mildly intrigued by it, started looking into it a little. Unfortunately, you know, some years later, she passed away from suicide, and that was really devastating for me. This was, you know, someone I was particularly close to, and I often say this was the first person I legitimately fell in love with. And it was during that time after she passed away where I really felt like my faith was coming into question. I'd reached out to God a number of times and never got anything, nothing like a sign or any kind of comfort or anything for that matter. I just felt alone and abandoned. And shortly after that had happened, I'd met a friend of mine who she also was into, Wicca and some of the pagan stuff, and she had encouraged me to look into alternative beliefs, stuff like the spirits of the ancestors, various different gods, you name it. And I kind of put my religious faith kind of to the side, and as I was exploring that, and over about 7 years or so it took me, and I just kind of one day, kind of as a joke, I asked Thor to help me out getting my car out of the snow, and like I said, it was more or less a joke, but it really happened for me. The first time I went to get my armed certifications, I'd never shot a firearm in any kind of competitive or qualifying kind of style with any sense of speed. I'd never really practiced drawing from a holster. So I was, understandably nervous. And I'd reached out and I said, you know what, let me just give this a try. And the night before, I had, tried to reach out to Thor, and, being that they're gods of war, I thought, it might be appropriate, being that I'm about to go, qualify with a weapon. And the day of the qualifier, I get up and I get on the range, and this wave of calm that I did not expect, given how nervous I was, just washed over me. And I passed the qualifier barely by the skin of my teeth, had plenty of work to do, but it was just this sense of calm that I'd had going into something I had no experience with, very little preparation for, and it paid off. And it was at that time that I kind of decided to start exploring paganism a little more. And I found that, in particular, the Norse gods were the ones that kind of fit with my worldview. Interesting thing I came to understand about paganism in particular is it's not necessarily worshiping specific gods or deities. It's the idea that there's a multitude of them out there.
Yeah.
My particular belief is I may worship the Norse gods, but I completely recognize that the God of Abraham is out there, and he's there for some people, and others he's not. And, if that's who you choose to follow, that's who you choose to follow. I don't take any issue with that. I found that paganism being more open and kind of allowing for, whatever fit you best was what I needed at that time, and it's just what I've stuck with, and it's worked for me.
Yeah.
Right on. It's funny, he kind of worships the Norse gods here. And it's funny because when I met Feldman, the first thing we clicked on was politics.
Mm-hmm.
So it's so funny because we're both constitutional conservatives, and me and him actually have a lot more agreement as far as Constitution goes than me and you. So I thought it was really funny. I thought I'd just bring that out there because we're both constitutional conservatives that believe in the value of individual liberty and so forth.
Yeah, if you agree with a pagan more than me, then you better examine your beliefs, bro.
Yeah, man, you know it. There's something there, man. Or maybe we just know the truth of what we believe, and you're wrong.
Hey, that could be a possibility. I mean,
maybe you're putting some eisegesis on the text.
I'm very rarely wrong, but it could happen. I do recognize that very slight possibility.
Right on.
And that was one of the things that for me was like the essence of paganism, was this idea of individual choice that just really clicked with me, being a constitutional conservative.
Yeah. You know what is interesting to me though is that you know our Constitution does derive its ethics from the Judeo-Christian faith, and yet you hold to that, but still, look at him shaking his head. But still, you accept the paganism aspect. So how does that mesh with your worldview?
It really doesn't. I think you'd actually be surprised at how similar the teachings and beliefs of people, at least in respect to the Norse gods, and that's all I can really speak to because that's all I've done the majority of my research on. There's actually a lot of similarities in the teachings about, how to treat people, how to be a decent person. I mean, obviously, the big issue we have with the Norse belief system is that they themselves didn't write anything down. So it's all oral tradition that was written down, many, many years later. Whereas with, Judaism and Christianity, it was written down at the time it was happening. But there's a lot of stuff, and particularly the poem The Havamal and the Poetic Edda, which the best analogy I can give it would be the Norse equivalent of the Book of Proverbs, if you will. It's essentially just a long laundry list of advice and wisdom that Odin has given to man. And a lot of it translates well to a modern Western ideology.
And when was that written down? Do you know?
I don't recall specifically. What I will say is this: there's two primary sources we generally look at regarding Norse mythology. You have the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda. The Prose Edda was written sometime in, I think, the 13th century, very heavily influenced by the Christianization of the Nordic countries. The Poetic Edda, however, given the language, is often regarded as, while it may have been written by Christian scholars, the language is similar enough to that is found in its limited capacity in Old Norse that it's believed to be relatively authentic, even if not 100% accurate, to the beliefs that would have been expressed by the people of that time, at least in my research. And again, I'm no scholar, so take what I say with a grain of salt. This is what I've come to understand through my research.
Okay, yeah, and I want to get back to that, but I first want to see why Titus is the only person that I know that says that the Constitution didn't derive from Christian Judeo ethics. Now, I understand we're not a Christian nation in the regards of we don't establish one religion over the entire thing, but as far as our ethics go, I mean, it does derive from that. Why would you say no?
I'm the only person who denies that. Like, you're non-Christian.
Absolutely, every scholar that I've consulted on this, from Larry Arnn from the Hillsdale College, who's lead professor there, and everybody that I know, and they even most atheists admit that it comes from that. So I mean, that's just funny to hear you say that the ethic doesn't derive from it.
Okay, it's a very complicated response, but I'll try to give it in a
nutshell. Do it in a nutshell.
Okay.
Bring it back to paganism.
I can see how there are values that are derived from the Bible that were applied to the Constitution. I see that. However, what I don't agree with is that the Constitution derives its values from specifically the teachings of Jesus. So when I look at the Bible, I don't read it in a flat way. I prioritize the teachings of Jesus, and then next is the teachings of the apostles and the rest of the New Testament, and then, finally would be the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures. So that's kind of how I view the Bible in terms of authority. And so when you examine the teachings of Jesus, like love your enemies, that certainly is not going to work for any secular nation. Care for the poor. You guys, I'm not sure about the Constitution per se, but most conservatives would say that the government should not be responsible for caring for the poor. It should be the church or family that should do that. So there, I'm assuming you're saying it shouldn't. That wasn't derived from Jesus' teachings. Blessed are the meek, blessed are the poor in spirit. These things will never work for a government. Like, you can't have that attitude and that Jesus preached as the ideal and be successful in a secular government. So that's a few of the teachings of Jesus. That's why I'm saying I don't think that a secular country can be based off the teachings of Jesus. It's not what the teachings of Jesus are for. It's not what they're designed for. And the other thing is, a lot of the morals that I think the Constitution pulls from are morals that every religion generally agrees with. Like, I think you would be very hard pressed to say that, like, capitalism, for example, can be derived from Jesus' teachings or from the New Testament. Like, it's not there. If anything, you could say that, like, the church in Acts was socialist. Like, they had all things in common. And I'm not advocating socialism for America at all.
Not even, but okay.
All right, so go ahead.
Socialism isn't voluntary.
Sure, but sure, none of the teachings of Jesus or the apostles were meant to be forced down people's throats, and that's exactly what governments do.
Even Paul said that a man is worth his wager, right? I mean, that's just simple Bible right there. But I look at God and this brings us back to God in the whole. I look at all of Scripture, and I prioritize the teachings of Jesus, but I do see a very good constitutional republic that does its best to deal with the fallen world. But back to paganism, I want to get back to that because that's what we're here for today. So that's one of the things that bothered me about paganism, and maybe you can explain this better, is your Eddas, and I read a lot about that, but my problem is, what are the gods to you? Are they sovereign?
Well, see, the thing with paganism is it's a very broad term, and it's different to different people. Like my friend who had really helped me start this journey, she still considers the God of Abraham to be the almighty being at the top of the food chain. But she also recognizes that there are other lesser spirits that are just as valuable. In my case in particular, I look at them not so much as sovereign rulers, but honored friends and kin that I stand alongside instead of kneel before. And that was another thing that really stood out to me in particular with the Norse tradition. Being that I am a constitutional conservative, I don't believe in kneeling before anybody, including God. I believe that a just and righteous God, for me, is one who I stand alongside. And that was something that appealed to me about the pagan tradition. Because I don't know with much of Christianity, but I know in Judaism, one of the things that you do is anytime God's name is mentioned in prayer, you bow your head before him. I understand that, to some that's a sign of respect, and I don't discount that. To me, it just felt like, acknowledging that there is someone above me. And to me, that felt like sacrificing my free will. So I look at the gods more as friends and kin rather than sovereign rulers.
So you don't worship them, is what you're saying?
No, not in the traditional sense. I don't pray to them in the traditional sense. I don't look at them as. I look at them as beings of greater power, but not as rulers or people who are necessarily above me in the sense of a strict hierarchical rule.
Yeah. So here's an interesting thing that you're saying is that there's. Your friend said there's like a hierarchy. So do you hold to that there's, like one God that rules them all type of thing, kind of like the Ring,
I suppose it's possible, and I don't discount that it could very well be the way that things are. For me, I look at that higher power, if you will, as essentially being chaos and the absence of order, more than a singular, all-powerful being.
Yeah, I was about to say, because if it was some sort of being, wouldn't that just be another form of monotheism with, spirits chucked in with it that have superhuman strength?
It could be argued. I mean, obviously there's a hierarchy within the structure of deities. You have your chief deities and you have their sons and the various different ones underneath them. But again, I don't look at it as if the deities themselves are sovereign over me. They're sovereign within their established hierarchy, but not necessarily over those who follow them.
So let me get this straight, because this is what it ultimately comes down to, and for me, any worldview needs to be able to correspond to reality and be coherent. And with a multitude of gods, I run into so many problems, whether it's the law of non-contradiction or anything else. But let me just name one. The law of non-contradiction is one, and then the fact that there's so many gods that can actually die. So how do you go about that? How do you explain that? How do these gods die? Why do they die? Odin's dead in Ragnarok, right?
As are most of them, in fact.
Yeah.
I think it boils down to a difference of definition, whereas in the Judeo-Christian tradition, God, to me, he comes across more of like a force of nature, and less of a person. He's a personified force of nature, much like many of the pagan gods were, but in a way that is all-encompassing. To me, God doesn't necessarily have to be truly immortal to be a god. I mean, we as human beings worship people like gods, in a manner of speaking, in the way that we treat celebrities, for example. It doesn't make them necessarily a god, but we treat them as such because they hold such authority and power in certain circles. And I think that's kind of how it translates in paganism. I mean, we look at something like Jesus Christ. In some circles, he's worshipped as the human incarnation of God, and he himself is God.
Yeah. So that I'd have to lead into that, as far as what is the nature of ultimate reality then? For you?
For me,
yeah,
it's really hard to say. Because keep in mind, a lot of my upbringing is through a Jewish lens of life. I spent the first 18 years of my life as a practicing Jew. What it boils down to me is faith and religion, they evolve over time, and given for me that it's not necessarily that one God is right and one God is wrong, but that they're all out there for whomever to follow. I don't have a problem recognizing that certain aspects of the Judeo-Christian tradition have more substance. I mean, what it boils down to is that there's so little written on the beliefs and practices of these ancient gods, just about any pantheon. It's hard to nail down a cohesive, all-encompassing worldview.
Yeah, that's for me. That's too incoherent for me, because it doesn't mesh well. It doesn't sit well with me, because you got these guys warring, and this is what I wanted to bring it into, because you were talking about, we're talking a little bit about right and wrong. I mean, where do you get a basis for that? Because I know you're a constitutional conservative. I know you believe in right and wrong. You believe in freedom. You believe that's an actual good thing. So, how do you justify if God A doesn't know what God B is going to do, and God B tells you to do this, but it contradicts what God, the other God says? How do you mesh with that? What's subjective morality to you?
Well, to the point where, one God may not know what the other God is saying. Isn't that the nature of human reality? We all say different things. We must agree on anything. But
that's human reality. We're talking about gods.
To get to the point, if you look at some of the poems, particularly the Havmal, the one I was referencing, there's a number of things in there that speak to a measure of an objective morality. To give you one example, there's a stanza early on that talks about how you're supposed to treat a wanderer who comes to your home looking for shelter. Things that, invite him inside, offer him food and drink and warm clothes, let him sit by the fire. That's not dissimilar from what, a Christian teaching would be on the subject, to my understanding. Like I said, it's really hard to nail down a all-encompassing worldview with a faith that so little was ever put to paper. You know, we have
but you guys don't have
all of the texts.
Yeah.
We have all of the texts for Judaism and Christianity. It's very easy to see the cohesive worldview. But when the worldview was shared primarily as an oral tradition, things get lost over the ages, and it becomes a little harder.
Yeah. So instead of following a lost worldview, I'm going to invite you to be a Christian today. Hey, Titus,
you wouldn't be the first. You won't be the last.
Hey, man, it's more cohesive. Jesus rose again. You know, I mean, he's the Alpha and the Omega. You know, he's the higher power.
I'm glad you bring up the story of Jesus rising again, because I would like to share with you there is a God in the Norse pantheon who does the same.
Okay.
So, the story of Ragnarok, as I'm sure you're aware, is the twilight of the gods, the great war to end the world, right? At the end of Ragnarok, the god Balder, one of Odin's sons, rises from hell, different spelling, same concept, it's the underworld.
Yeah.
But he rises from hell and then becomes the new chief of the gods. He rebuilds the world, if you will.
Well, that's depending.
Similar principle.
Falling all over the place here. That depends on your interpretation, right? Because Balder also was trying to. I heard he didn't come back from the text I was reading.
Again, it depends on which text you read.
Yeah.
And that's why it can get somewhat tricky, because there are plenty of texts that are written through a Christian lens.
Exactly.
You know?
So who's borrowing from who there, Feldman? So
I believe that version comes from the Prose Edda, which was written by a Christian hundreds of years after the end of the Viking Age. But again, it serves to go back to my point that religions and faith and belief can evolve over time. You know, they don't have
Christianity,
to be rigid.
Hey, so Titus, I want to get you in here real quick. You have anything you want to add to this, or?
Well, it sounds kind of like, David, you're saying, hey, look, your religion doesn't make sense, which I understand, which I understand because you're a Christian, and it doesn't make sense to me either, but that's because I'm a Christian, and generally, if we have a certain worldview that we were raised in, everything else sounds crazy. But I'm fully aware that if someone had never heard of Christianity, and I would try to tell them about this guy who died and rose again, and you can be washed in his blood, like they would flip out. Like, I don't want to be washed in anyone's blood, you know? So I appreciate that our religion sounds crazy too. But here's the question I would have for you, Brandon, is, and we always bring this question up, we talked about it in our last episode, do you believe that there's objective religious truth regardless of what people believe about it? In other words, if I would decide that I have a certain God and I name him Bartholomew Kermutza or something, and I would start worshiping this God, and a whole tradition would grow out of this worship, is that a legitimate religion if I have no basis for believing that this God exists? Or are there objectively gods that exist and legends about gods that do not exist? I think you kind of get where I'm going with the question, but I'm just wondering what you think about that.
I do. And for me, what it boils down to is that's how every religion started. Someone thought they spoke to a god and developed a worldview around that based on what they believed. I mean, the whole point of faith is that it's belief without concrete evidence. Now, that's not to say there isn't evidence of certain stories. For example, the 10 plagues of Egypt. We know now scientifically that such things could have happened. But the whole point of faith, whether it be religion or spirituality, is believing without concrete evidence. None of us here know what lies at the end of the road. None of us know for certain what happens after death. We believe because we have reason to believe, and that's all we needed.
So you kind of explained how religions are formed and how we come to our beliefs, or how a lot of people come to their beliefs. But I'd like to separate that question from the question of what actually exists. You know, it's one thing to describe how human beings have often come to believe that certain gods exist. It's another question entirely whether or not those gods exist. So my question is whether or not certain gods exist, regardless if people believe in them or not. And if certain gods do not exist, regardless if people believe in them or not. You see the difference there?
I do, and again, for me, it simply boils down to faith. For me, I can only believe what I see as far as reality and what I've experienced. You know, for me, I experienced a connection with the Norse gods. I've communicated with them. I've gotten messages and comfort from them, and that's, I believe in my own experience. I believe in what I can see and what I experience, and whether I'm right or wrong, I'll find out one day. But again, the whole point of faith is you believe even if there's no evidence to believe it.
You see, and that's
that's right or wrong.
Brandon, that's the opposite of Christianity. Christianity is, the very word pistos in the Greek is where we derive biblical faith from, which is trust. We trust in. We understand that there's belief that, but we also have belief in. So we believe that Christ rose again based off the evidence, right? We have minimal facts that we go off of when it comes to the resurrection, such as he was crucified, he was buried 3 days, and there was an empty tomb. We have not only does that correspond with the early manuscript data, the first century that comes from the people that actually knew it, because Christianity is not a religion where men work men work up to God. Christianity is a religion where God works down to man. He comes to man. He becomes a man, and Jesus claimed to be God. Famous passage in John chapter 8 when he says, "Before Abraham was, I am," using the word ego eme, which you should know from your your Jewish teachings that the ego eme is the same I am in Exodus. So he says, "I am." And that was his whole claim. And then not only that, but we correspond that with archaeological data and so on. So, our faith is based in evidence, and that's what we go off of. So our I guess that would be a little difference that we would have, right, Titus?
Well, you would certainly have that because you're an apologist. I would say a lot of Christians just roll with kind of what Brandon's describing, that sort of faith. So I guess the real question here is
faith then.
Not faith as defined by like an atheist who says that Christians are idiots for having faith. Faith as defined, believing something without evidence, which I'm not convinced that that's what the Bible means by faith either. But the real question is, what mechanism should we use to determine religious truth? Should we go off of evidence, or should we use this sort of believing something even if we don't have objective evidence? And I'm curious, Brandon, what you think about that, because the way you describe your religion is, you've had experiences, which is a type of evidence actually, but you have a faith that doesn't necessarily require evidence, whereas David is pretty much about the evidence, right? So how would you respond to that?
Well, first, I'd like to say maybe I may not have explained it quite as well. It's not that there's a total lack of evidence. It's that with Christianity, I acknowledge there is scientific evidence to corroborate the stories in the Bible, whereas there isn't so much with Norse mythology, and that may be because of how much of it was lost. It's more just that, I believe because of my experiences, which for a lot of Christians is why they believe. They communicated with their God. I'm not saying that one is right and one is wrong. Like I said, for me, it's the idea that they're all out there, and it depends which ones speak to you. For all I know, the ultimate end of faith is what the Christians and the Jews say it is, that there is a singular God and there is a heaven, and that's where you go if you're righteous. But how you get there is where I differ because of my own experiences.
So, yeah. To me, I hear what you're saying, that they're all out there, and that, the God of Abraham could be out there and stuff like that. But if the God of Abraham is out there, and he's like, I am the only one, I mean, that's what he said. I am, the Lord is one, right?
Well, if you actually look at the translation of the Ten Commandments, he simply said to worship no other God before him, not that he was the only God.
Yeah, but you're referencing Exodus, what is it, 23, right? 20 verse 3.
I couldn't tell you. I'm no biblical scholar either. So.
Well, that's why you got me here, right? No, I'm just
Right.
kidding.
But if my memory serves, the actual translation is worship no other God before me, because
You're right.
the Canaanites, the people who became the Jews, they were pagans. They were polytheists.
Absolutely. And, and I'm just going to push back on that just a little bit because, I have to. But, okay, so there's been, I understand that's a prominent view among some scholars that they said that Jews recognized other gods. That's actually been a big thing. That's a resurgence that's come within this last century alone. But if you can, and this is what bothers me about people and reading the Bible. They don't read the whole context. Moses explains what he meant by that in verse 20 or 23, when he talks about idols specifically, when he's talking about no other God. So he gives further detail on that exact commandment. And that's what a lot of people kind of gloss over because it fits with them. They kind of cherry pick it. And I'm not saying that you did that on purpose or you did that, but, read it all because it does explain it. And the context does explain it. Titus, looks like you want to say something.
Yeah. I'm actually going to sort of agree with Brandon here. Not that paganism is correct, but from my research, the term gods in especially the Hebrew scriptures simply means spiritual beings. And Israel saw Yahweh as the creator of the whole universe, including other spiritual beings. However, Yahweh was definitely not the only spiritual beings. Like they lived in a universe that was populated by many spiritual beings. However, Yahweh has no rival. He has authority over all these other spiritual beings or gods. It's often translated as gods. Even in the Hebrew scriptures. So it kind of comes down to semantics. Like, what do you mean by gods?
It's really
If you
not,
simply
though,
mean
Titus.
if you mean spiritual beings,
Titus,
there's lots of
I'll
gods.
let you go. Yeah, just let me go. But Titus, you know just as well as I do, you got to read the Bible in context. And it is explained in that very context, within that very same chapter. And it's very specifically talking about idols.
Yeah.
Very.
Yeah, I'm not talking about the context of the Ten Commandments per se. I'm just saying what the Hebrews actually believed about the universe, And I mean, it's confusing to say that they believed in multiple gods. I mean, it might as well just say spiritual beings, right? I mean,
No, because the Lord is one. I mean, the Jews have to write that on their heads. They have to have it on the bands of their wrists. The Lord is one. There's only one God. Okay, so maybe you talk about lesser, like angels and stuff like that, seraphim. That's fine. But when we're saying gods, I mean, you got to differentiate that because there is no other God, and that's yeah. Go ahead, Brandon. Go ahead.
If I might piggyback on something that was said a moment ago, I find it interesting. I've never actually heard a Jew use the name Yahweh, but aside from that, Yahweh was the name of a pagan deity in the Canaanite pantheon. Could it stand to reason? Possibly. Given what we know about how pagan traditions were practiced, that there were cults to specific deities and a group of people worshipped one deity over another, could it be possible, even in the remotest chance, that Judaism and by extension Christianity may have in fact had its origins in a pagan pantheon, which would explain the phrasing, thou shalt worship no other God before me, because he was commanding that they rebuke the other gods of the pantheon.
No, absolutely not. Like I said, the text explains it. You have to read that for yourself. The text actually explains it.
But David,
specifically, no, because I want to piggyback off of that because I've never heard of Yahweh being a Canaanite god. you know, as far as the Jews go, you know, it's not even Yahweh, right? I mean, we put the vowels in there or whatever. It's just YW. It's not. It's a tetragrammaton. It's not a word. It's just we have 4 letters, and then they put words to it later on. Or other letters to it later on. I can't remember. I'm a little fuzzy, but it's been a long day. So, but yeah, I mean, that's not the God of the Hebrews. Really distinct, fiercely monotheistic, and the fact that they were so fiercely monotheistic and detested paganism would kind of work against your theory there. Go ahead, Titus. I know you want to say something.
Oh, I mean, I want to clarify something I said because people might freak out and be like, "Oh, Titus is a polytheist."
Titus is a heretic. We all knew.
What I believe is that there's one spiritual being who created everything, including other spiritual beings, and he has no rival, and I believe his name is Yahweh. I do believe that a lot of the idols that other nations worshipped did have a spiritual dimension to them, where, this idol, the cult that worshipped these idols could have been actually worshiping a real spiritual being. However, I would say that those are spiritual beings who are in rebellion to Yahweh, and that ultimately are malevolent toward their followers. So just to clear things up in case some Christians out there are freaking out in a little bit.
Anything you want to add on to what I just said, Brandon?
Not really. I mean, it's a very complicated situation because, like I said, we've got most of what we have is written through a Christian lens. Christianity survived and paganism didn't. And I recognize that can be hard to kind of reconcile, but I mean, history is full of belief systems that have changed and evolved over time, and to suggest that it's not even remotely possible that the most predominant monotheistic tradition in human history could have started as a pagan belief. I just think it's naive to suggest that it's not even remotely possible.
Well, I mean, you're well versed in the Old Testament, so you know the story of Genesis. You know he came out of that when he had an experience with God, right? So God revealed himself to him. I mean, that's the whole point of the Christian message, is that God not only reveals himself to us, but then comes down and dwells with us, you know what I mean? And lives with us, and provides a sacrifice, which is another problem I have with paganism. It doesn't provide a solution for what we know is wrong with the world. I mean, this goes back all the way to mankind. I mean, paganism really, and you see this throughout the cultures, you see, that they have to placate gods, that because a natural disaster happens, and you see these gods that have specific purposes and specific roles, and I always had a problem with that. I mean, they seem like it was more their justification for natural disasters, or trying to get a good harvest or whatever. They had a lot of stuff like that. And you see that even in Norse paganism. They had different roles. They had different assignments to them. You had a god of war, god of mischief, stuff like that, and it continued, and Christianity, for me, it stood out different. It provided a solution. It said, yes, mankind has fallen, but you know what? There's redemption, and we know where you're going to go when you die, and to me, it coheres with reality and science because, I mean, the more we're discovering, like I said, we talk about the beginning of the universe and stuff like that and how it relates, when God says, he made the heavens and the earth. He made all of reality. It starts with God, and then you see the fall of man, and then you see Jesus Christ comes to redeem, and you see that it was prophesied that he would come as an atonement for mankind. And then, he makes these audacious claims, these radical claims that even most Jews rejected because they were, wanting Messiah ben David, right? They didn't want Messiah ben Joseph, They thought there was a war leader coming, someone that was going to take over. However, they got the atoner. And I think that was the big, mystery that, it was Jesus that came, the atonement. And he set mankind, redeemed mankind, so for me that it's so cohesive with what we see in the world, and it meshes so well. Titus, you want to jump in anywhere?
I was gonna give the altar call after that sermon.
Sorry about that. Sorry. Yeah. Supposed to be
No.
We should probably wrap up here shortly. I'll give my last word, and then we'll hand it over to Brandon for the final word here. But I was gonna say, you entered into paganism because of spiritual experiences you had, and I think that people come to their religious beliefs through different routes. And for David, it's through an intellectual assessment of the data, of evidence and facts. For you, it was a spiritual experience. And so we're all wired to come to our conclusions differently. And so I would suggest, I don't know if you've ever tried this, but pray to Jesus, pray to Yahweh, and say, hey, I believe in these other gods right now, and I'm praying to them, but if you are real, reveal yourself to me and show me that clearly, and show me that in a way that's more powerful than any other experience I've had, and just see what happens. So I would just leave you with the challenge to do that experiment.
While I would happily accept your challenge, I've tried. I have tried, and I've gotten nothing in return. So, like I said, for me, I don't discount the existence of the God of Abraham. He just isn't there when I need him, whereas the gods of the Norse were.
All right.
Hey, that's all I can say, man.
Yeah, no, I hear you, man. Religious experience is hard one to kick. I mean, it is part of the evidences that I use in my cumulative case, because evidence is a big factor, and I think God is the best explanation, like I said, for beginning of the universe, for objective morality, and for the resurrection of Christ, and the reliability of the scriptures we have, and also for religious experiences. I do believe that those religious experiences are testable, that you do test them, and sometimes you can get something that you think is a religious experience, and then it's not. And then there's sometimes that you can't disprove it. You can't disprove someone else's religious experience. So it is a powerful thing. So I do recognize, and I want to say that I respect it, but and it is part of the overall cumulative case of why I believe in Christ. So other than that, yeah, man, that's all I got.
Hey, Brandon, thanks for coming on. This was great. Hopefully we can have you on again sometime.
Yeah, would you like to come back on, dude?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, it was fun, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely, 100%. I appreciate y'all having me on.
All right. Talk to you later.
All right, bye.
Later, guys.